All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Spring Boot Architecture. So I want to dig a little bit more into what controllers and services and models and what these concepts really mean, because they're not specific to Spring Boot. None of them actually. So let's pull open the covers a little bit and see what's under all this. So in a Spring Boot app, Spring Boot API, I guess. An HTTP request goes to a action on a controller which calls something from a service which uses a repository which accesses something from a database. Also takes the stuff that comes back from that database, instantiates a model for it, which comes back to the service, which comes back to the controller action, which makes an HTTP response. Okay, so that's this shape. Before we go any further, questions about this? All right. So a lot of this, there's two big things that this comes from, this whole thing. One is an architecture pattern called MVC, or Model View Controller. The rest of it comes from DDD, or Domain Driven Design. So let's talk about the MVC side first. So the idea behind MVC, which is, like, this is an architecture pattern. It applies to everything from command line apps to REST APIs to video games to all kinds of stuff. Super common object-oriented programming pattern. The idea is that what a user interacts with is a controller. A controller works with a model which presents itself as a view, which is the thing the person actually sees. So when you click a button, the thing that handles you clicking that button goes on a controller. Now, the controller's only job is handling that interaction, figuring out the logic that really comes out of that. And we'll see how we split that up into the controller part and the service part in a sec. But anything that's about handling that interaction gets initiated in the controller. The model's the data, and everything that we have to interact with the data, including database, whatever else. So we'll see how we split that into a model and a repository in a second. And then the view is a representation of the model. Not necessarily the only representation of the model, a representation of the model. So the same data could be JSON, it could be XML, it could be HTML, it could be somebody reading it out loud in an audio file. All of those are views. They could be different views of the same underlying data. The reason that this pattern exists is an idea called separation of concerns. By making the view completely independent of the controller and the model, we can keep this a lot more straightforward. And we can do things like have multiple views for the same model, all those different formats I was just talking about. If your view also has a bunch of interaction logic in it, you can't really tease out just that presentation piece of it. If the view is also concerned with how it retrieves the data that it gets a little bit harder to swap out that view for a different one. The controller, similar kind of thing. If your interaction with this is also concerned with data retrieval logic and stuff, we get a lot less reusability in both the model and the controller. So we could also think of this as behavior or logic, data, presentation, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. See this pattern all over the place. When you interact with something, you're interacting with the controller. That does whatever it needs to do with the data. The view reflects the current state of the model. That's what you see or hear or whatever. That's the pattern there. Ask me some questions about that.
I just have a quick question about the model.
Yeah.
You know, the process in Spring Boot here, it's going out to our database, right, and gathering whatever we had requested. The model, is the model like a copy of the data, or is it just the continual transfer of the data we're requesting?
All right, so that's a great question. So in Spring Boot, we split up the model and the repository. The repository's job is the actual like fetching and what have you.
Right.
But think about what comes back from a query. So like, for example, if I pSQL, Barkwire API, Okay, so if I like query the API and I get those three things back, like I can't do anything with that in Java. It's just a big string of text. It looks fine. You could say that this is a view of the data in the database, but Java's going to have a hard time figuring out what to do with all of that. It doesn't know how to break it up. So what it can do is say, all right, take the thing from this first column here, make a new instance of the dog class, set the ID property to this, set the description property to this, set the image URL property to this. Actually, you're going to need to make 3 instances of that dog class. So the model is like the Java representation of this data. What came back from the like repositories requests to the database was like literally just this. More importantly, our model is part of a bigger thing that we'll talk about with DDD, which is like, what are the nouns in the problem that you're solving, and what kinds of attributes do they have? What kind of derived data? So for example, your database might store a birth date, but it might be useful for you to have an age. Don't store both of those in the database. That's stupid. Then you need to, what, every single day update any age columns that need it. You can derive the age from the birthday and the current date, so you can actually do that on the model. You're not just limited to doing things that you're storing in the database on there. You could say, I want to pull out the data, the birth date, but I want to add this property to, or this method to the model called get birth date, which calculates what that instance's age is. Or sorry, yeah, get age. And then I don't want to include the birth date at all in the response. I just want the age, but I have to calculate that off of something in the database. So like the idea that a dog or a person or a student or whatever might have an age or some other calculated property, that's part of its model, not always part of its like data at rest. Matt, does that like illuminate anything?
It does. No, it does. I mean,
Okay.
because really, it's basically we're working with whatever SQL queries are in our repository, right? I mean, it's
Right.
it's basically our output of what we had queried or manipulated
Right.
that we're going to be using then in our application, right?
Right. And like a repository is specific to like database communication. Models are not. Models are
Okay.
more broadly about like, how does this data get used in this application? What kinds of attributes does any particular thing have? Because remember, if we have a dog model, it's a model because it's not literally a dog. Maybe like, your dog has fur color or something like that, but that's not important for your problem, so it's not part of the model of a dog, even though it's literally part of like an actual dog. So you're figuring out which parts of the noun you're working with are relevant to the application. That's what the model of a piece of data is. But the implication is it's always simplified from reality. We can't include everything that something is in reality, but we can come up with a model of what the real thing is that works for our purposes. Great question. More. All right. If you'd be so kind as to head over to Inbox, I would like to check your understanding. Prompt is posted. Let's take a couple minutes on that. All right, 4 minutes. Get cracking, America. All right, pencils down. Send me what you got. So overall, not great, but like we're getting there. We're making progress. So let's see. Scott, I liked yours. Would you read that out?
Yeah, sorry, just a sec. I said the controller is what the user is interacting with. It takes in the actions, and then using logic, it determines what happens with those actions. The model is the data that's being interacted with. It is organized in a specific way, and the view is how that data is presented back to the user.
Great answer. Sean, you also had a very good answer. Would you read that back?
Yeah. The controller will be the housing for the logic. The model will dictate the shape or representation of the data when passed through the repository, and the view will be the rendering of that data for the user to see.
Yes. Now, repositories aren't necessarily used in all MVC stuff, but otherwise, super good answer. And then I saw a good analogy with a TV. Let me put a different spin on it, though. So, if we're trying to apply MVC to watching TV, the remote, that's the controller. The TV set with like all the guts of it and stuff, that's the model. That determines like what we can do. These buttons, you just press them. You press the change channel button or volume up button. Cool. So the controller takes your interaction with that, but like the actual like state of the volume, what channel you're on, all that kind of stuff, that's the model. That's what the actual thing is. And then your actual stuff that you see on the screen, like that pixel grid, or on an old school TV, it's a little light that's being traced by the cathode ray tube. That's the view. Ask me some questions. So yeah, TV might have an interface that's like volume up, volume down. Might have a get volume. Might have a scan channels. So like those are all things that the TV allows you to do. The view is like a particular arrangement of pixels. So the red is really bright, and then the blue is like sort of dark, and then the blue is really bright on this one, and then this one sort of ends up looking yellow. So like that whole grid of stuff that you see on the screen, that's the view. And this controller is like handle button 3 press and hold. Like whatever that is, whatever's supposed to happen when you press and hold this button. Oh, it goes over to the model and tells it to set its state up. its volume or whatever. Because that's also part of the view of this, like the speakers. So in programming terms, it's like whatever that sinusoidal signal that gets sent over to the speakers, that's also the view. So yeah, and the model is also like current, get the current track, get the current channel, all that stuff. And then the view is a representation of that data. More questions about MVC?
So I know we're not talking about repositories at the moment, but in the TV example, would that be pretty much like the TV connecting to the internet to get the channel, pretty much? And that's like the fetch request?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
I like that.
Thank you.
And like repositories might also like be your DVR or something. So like let's say it goes out and fetches stuff, but there's other stuff that it prefetches and it just sort of keeps around. And so maybe you're requesting some show. Maybe it actually needs to come from the internet. Maybe it's actually being stored already. The thing requesting it doesn't give a shit. So the logic of like whether it already has it saved or it needs to go fetch it or where it fetches it from, what ways that it phrases that request, like that's all the repository's concern. Something that's using the repository doesn't care.
So the model is going to like kind of set up what it is that we want to see, and the controller is going to be the thing that just fires that off so that it gets represented correctly through the view.
Bingo.
Okay.
You turn on the TV, you change the channel, you set the channel, you hit the Netflix button. All that gets handled by
those
the
things. Yeah, those commands already exist in the model. It's just the controller is what actually pushes it.
Right.
Okay,
It's
cool.
what's mapped, because like there's more than one way to do that, right? Like
Right.
you might have that on your remote control. You might also have buttons on your TV that handle that. Those are two different controllers that work with the same model.
So if I know we've just been building like really basic apps so far. Would you have multiple models for multiple? So like one model would be the volume, and then you'd have, you can have like 10 models in one app, or is it just all within the one model file?
No, think of it more like, first of all, there's definitely more than one model. But I would probably say, I don't know, the TV is probably all one model. I could also buy, is a channel a model? Not really. Because, like, it's a state of the TV, like what channel that it's on. There's no real concept of a channel outside of the current one that a TV is tuned into. But if I were making an API for Sika, student would be a model, performance would be a model, evaluation would be a model, like topic would be a model, question would be a model, questions plural would be a model. All of those would be different models.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
And in Spring Boot in particular, models almost always, I can think of like a couple instances where it wouldn't, but they're rare, almost always map directly to a database table. Other questions about MVC? Cool. Before I move on, I want to ask that same question in inbox again. Give me just a sec. All right, same question. Let's do better answers this time. Fingers crossed. All right, go for it. Another 30 seconds. All right, pencils down. Send me what you got. Okay, these answers are a lot better. All right, I'm into this. Last questions about MVC before I shift over to DDD.
Well, I had tried to tie it back to something that was a little more simple, and I was afraid that it might be too flat.
Okay.
Mentally, I was thinking about this whole setup that we have here in front of us,
Uh-huh.
and I was tying it back to Beyonce.
Okay.
So if we were going to do that, we would say that the model is all those built-in methods that we have available. The controller is us actually creating that line of code that is going to use those models, and the view is going to be that displaying of that data. Is that too flat, or is that on
No, it's
par?
not 100% wrong. I would say that the model is the data. Like, It is an object that has two keys, hits and movies, each of which has these characteristics to it. That's the model. The controller would be the function that you call that gets Beyonce's top 3 movies or whatever. And then the view is like you console logging that string output.
Okay, awesome.
The best like litmus test I've heard for whether or not something is MVC is whether or not it's themeable. Can you swap out one presentation of the data for another presentation without changing anything about the model or the controller? That's a pretty good sign that you've got good separation of concerns. All right, so let's talk about just a little bit about domain-driven design. DDD is a huge topic. Here, I'll show you exactly how huge it is. So this is the book that it comes from. It's not short. So this is the design of domain-driven design. It's more complicated than MVC, but it's also an approach to architecture that's mainly focused around reusability and really making your code domain-centric rather than code-centric. So let's talk about this word domain a little bit. So domain comes from math. So if you have these inputs and it generates those outputs, then you'd say that's the domain and that's the what? Anybody? Range. So, domain and range are things that we talk about with algorithms, functions, that kind of stuff. Domain is the range of acceptable inputs. Range is the range of possible outputs. So this math idea is super handy in business. As we can say, all right, we're making an education app. What is part of that domain? Well, there's learners, and they submit submissions, which are evaluated by a coach. All of those nouns in there, that's part of the domain. It also includes the actions that we can take. Evaluation, that verb, I guess evaluation's the noun. Evaluate would be the verb. That's part of the domain also. It's this range of concepts and behaviors that are specific to a problem that you're solving. So in car loans, I don't know anything about them, but like you would have a borrower who takes out a loan. I don't know if there's a more specific vocab word from a creditor that has terms. So like all of those things are part of a domain. And so how you model that domain is how do I, in this stuff that has infinite nuance and complication, understanding that it's not the actual thing itself, what makes this a concrete set of things with a finite set of properties and a finite set of behaviors? That's called domain modeling. So you go, oh, well, a borrower, a borrower can put their kids to bed and drive to work in the morning and do a whole lot of things that aren't part of the domain. But a borrower can borrow. A borrower can default. Like all of those sorts of things are part of the domain modeling. And so if you can make those things finite, now you can make them methods on things. All that stuff is domain modeling. So how this applies to MVC and Spring Boot and stuff is that we have this concept of services and repositories. Both of these come from domain-driven design. So if a controller is specific to, so we'd have one controller for the remote on the TV. We'd have a different controller for pressing the buttons on the TV itself. It's handling whatever that interaction is and then figuring out what to do. So the idea of a service is that a service uses domain language. A controller, this is using the language of whatever this interface is. Handle button press, that kind of stuff. So in our case, each of these actions is like create, read, update, delete. It's stuff that happens from HTTP requests. The things that happen in our domain, list all the students. Find a student by their student ID. Like, you don't find student by student ID in a car loan app. Not part of that domain. So anything that is part of the domain happens there. And that is separate from the repository, which is handling all of the database interaction logic. No domain logic is in the repository. The repository just figures out, how do I get this data? Does it come from a database? Does it come from yet another API? Is it hard-coded? Like, all those are perfectly fine data sources. None of them change any of the logic of the domain, though. Where the data comes from, where it gets sent to, where it gets pulled from, that's not the service's business. The service is just domain logic. It also doesn't care that it was called by a controller, because it also could have been called by a CLI app. It also could have been called by, so this is a RESTful API, could have also been called by a SOAP API. That was the thing that came before REST. Sucked. It could come from an RPC API, which, these have their problems too, but they're kind of coming back in style. It could come from, most of what I do on the LMS actually isn't RESTful. It's socket-based, so you can do real-time. I might have controllers for all of these. This one is just the REST controller. But those can use all the same domain things. Maybe there's a CLI command to evaluate a submission, to approve a loan. Maybe there's also a SOAP thing for that, an RPC thing for that. But these different controllers all use the same domain logic. That's what a service is. How the actual data is ferried to and from wherever it rests, that's the repository's job. And then the model now doesn't have to worry about that shit at all. The model is also part of the domain. So this is the shape of the data. This is things we can do with that data. We can retrieve it, we can update it, we can add it, we can search, we can, all that sort of stuff. You might have more than one service that interacts with a model. You could have all kinds of different models that any particular service needs to work. All that's legit. If I have a service that one of the things it can do is evaluate a submission, so it's going to create an evaluation and it's going to need a submission, there's two models that service has to work with. I want to save the evaluation. So I tell the service tells the model, hey, it's time to save. And then the repository goes, okay, cool, I know how to save. That's sending an insert query into the database. The service doesn't know that it's an insert query. That's not part of the domain. That's how domain-driven design sort of fits into this. Ask me some questions about it.
So can the MVC not have multiple models? Is that unique to domain or?
No, not at all. MVC can have as many models as it needs to. As many controllers, as many models, as many views.
Okay.
So what the domain-driven design stuff adds on top of it is like, there's no concept of a service or a domain or a repository in like pure MVC. This is still like pretty damn MVC-ish. So for our REST APIs, the controller is the thing that catches the HTTP request. That's the interaction. It's also, and then we'll go, hey, I need to go get me some data. And so the model also includes the repository part of it, where it needs to figure out how to fetch that. It needs to figure out how to represent that in our application, like as a Java object. And then the view is going to be our HTTP response. So think about how we made a hash map, gave it that Pokemon key, and then added this, like all of that is the view. And really, we haven't done any custom, a little, like just those hash maps. But the process of taking one of these models and presenting it as a JSON object with all, like, that's called serialization. That's a very specific to REST concept. So actually, after sleeping on it last night, I think I mentioned yesterday, I could see moving that JSON formatting stuff into the service. I'm off of that. Because it would be done differently with the REST controller versus a SOAP controller versus an RPC controller versus a socket controller. So really, those controllers should be responsible for applying that particular formatting. The service doesn't need to know how it's going to be formatted.
So for the model, since it's going to house pretty much all the different possible shapes that our data could take, if we had, for example, a service that was, I don't know, update Pokemon image URL, but
Okay.
there is no model for image URL.
No,
That's
the image URL is an attribute of Pokemon.
Mhm.
So an attribute and a model are different things. An attribute's a characteristic, or it's like some piece of state in a model. So the Pokemon itself, that's a model.
Okay.
Now, we could, like, and I assume that this is probably how they did it on the actual Poke API. You could have a Pokemon model that also contains, like, some abilities models, some sprites models. You could split that up a little bit. And that would be especially useful because, like, different Pokemon share abilities sometimes. So, like, how do we model that in the domain? And ultimately, what that model starts looking like is, okay, one Pokemon can have many abilities, And each ability is owned by one Pokemon? No, each Pokemon, so there's a many-to-many relationship there. So then that modeling becomes how you represent this domain. And so your model might say, oh, I'm an owner, I own dogs. Oh, I'm a dog, I'm owned by an owner. All that stuff's part of the model too. But something like a dog's name, that's not a model. That's a characteristic of the dog. More questions about domain modeling? Cool. So this afternoon, I'll do a walkthrough of the search stuff, and we'll get to see some of this in action. Because like search doesn't map directly to a repository method, so we'll have to pull a little bit of sauce on it. But should be interesting. All right, I hope this helped clarify some architecture ideas, help you see how the pieces fit together. Elsewise, have a good lunch.